Hey everybody, so this is just a quick little video to help out with the homework assignment for chapter 170 due today. People had some questions about 3 and 4. Question 3 asks to use the economic theories of regulation from chapter 10 to help explain the patterns of regulation and deregulation in the U.S. surface transportation sector. And there's really a couple of main things that I think stand out for this, and so I'm going to kind of try to map it out for us on the whiteboard because why not? So remember, in the transportation sector, the surface transportation sector, we start out with regulating trains because of a lot of volatility in the price. So we start out with regulating trains. Oops, that's not how you spell trains. Because of price volatility. We know that they had tried to engage in collusion and set contracts from previous chapters, and it led to increased volatility because even though there were cartel contracts for the trains, there was a lot of mistrust and a lot of outside forces driving price changes that led to breakdowns in the cartel. So we can think about that as being a time when regulation was caused by a need, right? By public outcry that the industry wasn't behaving appropriately. And then over time, the next thing that happened was that regulation expanded to the regulation of the trucking industry. And eventually, what was it? The water freight or mariners, right? The regulation of the shipping industry by boat. And this was seen as an example of how regulation can be imperialistic in that it expands to consume other industries. But we can also think of it as an example of either capture theory or the industry's opinions, right? Because the train industry didn't like that other types of transportation weren't being regulated. And so they said, hey, if you're going to regulate us, regulate a close substitute of ours, right? Regulate trucking. So that was because of firm outcry, really, right? Or the desire to expand a regulatory body, right? And so that gives us that push-pull that we see in the economic theory of regulation of, yes, there's consumer outcry, but it's also based on industry demand. Industry saying, hey, serve us too. We give you money too, right? The population gives regulators votes, but industry gives regulators rewards in the form of lobbyists and that kind of thing, right? And then later on, we see periods of deregulation in both industries driven by not public outcry, but by desire for the firms to be and the industry to be deregulated, especially in the case of the rail industry. They were really struggling with the price constraints and with the exit constraints. And so if you think about that sort of timeline of surface transportation regulation and deregulation, think about who benefits, who is asking for it, and how that ties into that economic theory of regulation, which, you know, is sort of the preferred model. But you could also talk about capture theory and say, you know, maybe regulatory agencies kind of became captured by the trucking industry because it was so successful. And then they used that to really hinder the train and rail and freight industry. So that's kind of the general idea, is that these regulations and then these periods of deregulations had different motivating factors and served different groups, different special interest groups. And that's what the economic theory of regulation says. It says that these interest groups are going to fight for regulation and deregulation that benefits them. And we're going to see the ebb and flow of regulation kind of depend on who has the ear of the regulator or the most power in the time. Does that kind of make sense? It kind of clears it up. So it really is a connection between those two ideas. I think that's a really fun way of looking at it. The other question that somebody asked was for me to go over question number 4. And question number 4 talked about vertical unbundling of the electricity industry and how that allowed for deregulation. And this question, again, it's not designed to be so stressful. It's really just reminding us what the natural monopoly associated with electricity comes from. So first of all, remember that the idea of vertical bundling is this idea that electricity generation the provision of the electricity utility comes from this idea that there's some electricity generated, right? And then there is distribution. What is it? There's 2 words that sound like distribution. There's distribution and there's retail, right? There's basically 4 main stages of how electricity moves through moves from being made to being distributed to households. And it's this vertical process, right? Because it's taking it from the very early stages of creating electricity, of actually generating the electricity, down to the actual retail, right? So we have generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. And this gets at what we talked about in the beginning, right? This idea that firms could vertically integrate. Remember Alcoa, the aluminum firm, did vertical integration, basically controlled every stage of aluminum production, from pulling it out of the ground to retailing products made out of aluminum to even recycling the sort of secondary market aluminum. That's that vertical thing we're talking about. In this case, vertical unbundling allowed the electricity utility to break it down and kind of separate the natural monopoly from the parts that didn't have to be a natural monopoly. Does that make sense? So what we're looking at is basically that kind of dynamic issues in monopoly regulation, in natural monopoly regulation. That's kind of what we were leading up to when we got to here. This idea that not all natural monopolies are as constant as they seem, right? Yes, an electricity utility seems like a natural monopoly. There's this really high fixed costs and really low per unit cost that give us this cost curve that looks like this, where it doesn't make sense for there to be multiple firms, right? We want one firm producing electricity for millions of people rather than 10 firms producing for 100,000 people each or something like that. But in this case, by separating generation away from transmission, distribution, and retail, we could create some competition. And through that competition, try to reduce the level of regulation. So by taking retail, distribution, and transmission away from generation, we allowed for multiple retailers. And that's what we did in the electricity industry. Let me find a good pen here. So they broke retail out and said, okay, you can buy it from multiple firms. You can buy it from the utility, or you could buy it from those non-utility providers. So you have the utility distribution companies, and then there were these other non-utility electric service providers, and that created some competition in the market. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. The point of this question is to kind of understand what vertical bundling does and how it worked, because it is a little bit complicated. But the idea here is by separating out the stages of electricity, we could distribute it to these different retailers, get the generation separated from the retail, and create competition where it might not have been present up here. So hopefully that helps. Let me know what other questions you have, and have a great weekend. I'll see you all next time.